All right, we're going to start off with a quick tour of a notebook. Okay, as you can see, there are a couple of videos below. This is the notebook that was described above. And actually, all the videos below are going to use just this one notebook. I've split it into separate videos so that it's easier for you to digest and to plan your time around. So you can say, maybe do one, go away, do something else, come back, do another one. And this first video is just going to be sort of helping to orient you to the notebook and to Python, which is the programming language that runs inside this notebook. So a notebook is just a place, and it's based upon the idea of a scientific notebook, right? Where a scientist would be at their lab bench and they'd be doing experiments and they write everything down in their notebook so that they know exactly what they've done. And what's nice here is that you can combine code you're working on with bits of text and images and stuff like that. And what that allows you to do is, if we sort of scan through this, you can see I have text, and then I have something that looks like code, text, something that looks like code, and I can put these all together in such a way that I can provide context to the code I'm working on. And when it's not just that I see the code here, I can actually run the code inside the notebook. So let me show you how that's done. So here I have a cell here, and you'll notice that when I click on it, it says sort of Markdown here. Markdown is similar to HTML, and that it's a way to format text. Actually, if I double click on this cell here, I'll say I'll see the Markdown. And then to get the Markdown to render, I just actually click Run Cell, and then it renders that there. So that was all Markdown. I can also have cells that are code, and you can see here I've selected code. And if I run that cell, instead of running it like I did with the Markdown and making it change the formatting, it's going to actually run the code. Okay, and you can think about this as running the code too. The text block is running the code, but it's running the Markdown and formatting the text. Whereas here we're going to actually run some true, honest-to-goodness code. So if I go ahead and click Run here, you'll see what happened is it spit out some text. I could have just as easily had this say "Hello World," and I think you all would have recognized and appreciated that. But what's going on here is you have this function, and it's a print function, just like the functions we saw in JavaScript. There's a name of the function, and then there's a parenthetical, and then you pass it some value. This is actually very similar to the alert function that we saw in JavaScript, where we pass in some text, and that text is echoed back out to us. Here, however, it's echoed back out to the notebook. And so that's our very first little function. So if you go ahead and you run your notebook and you got that there, you know it's working. You've got your first little bit of code running, and you've done your first little Python programming. So yay! So there are a couple things to know what's going on here. So we could run it by clicking this button here. And also a nice little shortcut is you can hit Shift and Enter, and that also runs a cell. You can add new cells and subtract cells by doing different things here. So if I'm in a cell, you have to be in a cell to run it, right? And that also sort of tells you where you are on the page. But I could select a cell, and then I can hit this plus button. I can make a new cell, or I can be in a cell and I can hit this scissors icon, and then it'll delete the cell. I can move where the cells are, right? So I can be in a cell and I can move it down. You see it jumps down here, or I can move it up in relationship to other cells. And so what you do is you're working around, you're typing some stuff, you make a new cell, you write some new code, blah, 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 and you can run it, you can make a new cell, you can delete it, etc. And so it's sort of like the console we were working with JavaScript, except now we can make something, it's persistent, it stays there, we can go back and run it again, we can write things around it. I want to just mention something called the kernel. Okay, so you'll see up here we have this drop-down menu for the kernel. You'll also see if I mouse over this, it says interrupt the kernel or restart the kernel. The kernel is sort of like the instance of the notebook that's running on the computer. And so it's the entire notebook sort of running on the computer. When you have the computer running some code and it's thinking, you can tell what the kernel is doing. If you sort of look up here, there's this little dot. watch really quickly that dot will turn solid. It was just for a fraction of a second because there wasn't much thinking here. But if it's thinking on something, you can look up there and you can see that the notebook is, would be thinking. Right now, if I mouse over, it says kernel idle. If it was running, it would be doing something that would be solid. You can always stop the kernel by clicking this stop button here. Or if everything goes wrong, just like with your computer, you can restart by clicking here and restarting the kernel. Now, if you do that, though, you'll lose everything that you won't lose what's written in the notebook, but if you had loaded, say, a variable, that variable won't be there again because you've sort of started from scratch. So you don't eliminate the stuff that's in your code blocks, it's just that you make it as if you've never run them, okay? So that's a little bit about the kernel. You can save, of course, by clicking the save button or by using File, Save, and Checkpoint. And so that's just sort of a quick tour of a notebook. Before we close out this video, though, let's just orient you a little with Python. And hopefully this orientation will be pretty familiar because it's going to remind you a lot of what we saw before with JavaScript. I'm going to go through and I'm going to be a little boring, and I'm going to try to read a little bit of this while I'm going through with you, to you, because the last time I tried to do the video, I realized that I wrote a lot. I was much happier with what I wrote than what I was saying. So to keep me honest, we'll sort of read together. Now, just so that you're like, well, wait, why can't I read this myself? You could, right? So if you don't want to watch all these videos, you could just work through the notebook, and that would be fine. Although in my experience, I think people are happy to have someone walking through with them. And I might provide a little more color commentary and some context to some of the stuff as we go through. But I'll leave it to you as to how you want to approach working through this notebook, whether with me and you working together here while I'm in the video, or if you just want to read through. Either way, you can always, if you're watching me, you can pause me, you can go back. If you go through and try to just read this and it's not making much sense, you can come back and watch the video. I think by now, hopefully you're starting to get a feel for how best you learn in these different situations. That being said, I hope you'll stick with me because I like the videos. And I hope you do too. And yes. All right, enough of that. So what we're going to do first is just introduce some concepts that you already know. So you know about variables, right? Variables are containers for your data. And just like with JavaScript, you define a variable by giving the variable a name and then using an equal sign to assign some content into that variable. And here we're going to say content goes here, and we're going to throw that in that variable. So if I run this cell, what should happen is I'll create a variable and I'll assign it the content goes here, right? So I'm going to run this. I can click the run button here, and nothing happened. Well, not nothing, right? I did notice that what was blank here before turned into 4. And that's actually the number of cells I've run. So this is the 4th cell I've run since I started. And you'll realize that what I did is here, I ran this cell 3 times, right? But that helps you sort of know the order of how things are going. It's important to notice that, to note that you actually can run cells in any order you want. And that's important to think about because say if you define a variable in this cell, you run it, and then you go down here, you're not going to be able to have access to that variable until after you've run this cell. So if you jumped and tried to run this cell without running this one, it might not have that variable there. So you might run into an error. So you want to think about what order you're executing those cells because you can do them in any order. So there I have my variable. Well, it looks like nothing happened, right? To see if something happened, I can actually just take the variable and get it to echo back. This is similar to the behavior we saw in the console in JavaScript, right? So I go ahead and I just run that. Oh, okay. It echoes back out what is inside the variable. Now, it's doing this because the variable here is the last thing in the cell. If I had changed that and I said print hello, and I run that cell again, it just gives me the thing that I said print to. It doesn't tell me what the variable value is anymore. So if I have multiple lines, and when I'm running the cell, I'm just hitting shift return. If I have multiple lines, then I need to use this print function here. So here I'm going to have variable example 1 called content. I'm going to print it. Variable example 2, again, I'm going to print it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to print example 1 and example 2 right next to each other. So let's see what that looks like. And as you might expect, to get content, more content, content, more content. Okay, so each print function actually it'll do it on one line. So a new print function will put something on a new line. I can mix in text with my variables if I want to echo them back. So here's print. I can do variable 1, and then I can do the variable. I can do variable 2 in the variable, and then you might recognize this. I think we touched upon this before in one of the other, in another context. This is a special character saying new line, okay? And so I go ahead and I execute this cell, and I get variable 1, content, and then new line, and then variable 2, more content, so what their value is. Just a quick word about functions, right? We know functions from JavaScript. Functions like a little program that you pass information to. So in the print function, we're passing it what we want it to print, and it prints it out. Just like with JavaScript, there are data types, okay? And there are different types of, the data types are different types of containers for different types of data. So we have numbers. There are different types of numbers, but we're just going to say numbers right now. And so we have a variable, and we can set a number by, just like in JavaScript, by typing a number without it inside any quotes. And so that's going to go ahead and we can print number example equals 1. And so that's how we would define a number. Just like in JavaScript, we also have strings, and we can define a string by putting inside quotation marks. Python's happy to use either single quotation marks or double quotation marks. Why you would use one over the other depends in part upon what's the content inside. So if I start off a variable and I define it by starting it with a single quote, it's going to end it when it finds another single quote. If I start it with a double quote, it's going to end it when it finds another double quote. That's useful if I want to include a single quote inside that string, right? Because it's not going to break at that single quote. It'll break at the double quote. If I had used single quote here and here, then it would have gotten confused and thought that was the end. So you just want to be careful about whether or not you're using single or double quotes. And so I can just put that in here. I can avoid the problem of escaping, of having these single quotes, double quotes. If I want to have a lot of mixed things in there, I can use escape characters. And so you'll sort of recognize this from similar context from regular expressions. We use the slash to sort of say, hey, treat this thing after it a little differently. And so, or actually the backslash here. And so here we have, you can actually use it as an escape character where I can say, hey, I can start a string off with double quotation marks. Then I can include double quotation marks inside my string as long as I have this backslash in front of it. And then it's going to realize, oh, no, that's not the end of the string yet. It actually literally is a quotation mark. And so that's very similar to your experience with regular expressions. So I can go ahead and I can do that. So there we go. I've got the string contains a contraction and a quote. Ooh, isn't that cool, right? And we're not going to use it much here, but you also actually can use triple quotes in Python to do multi-line strings. Okay. But those are very similar to what you saw in JavaScript and should not be new and surprising, which is why I'm not spending much time thinking of talking about them. What is new, however, well, actually, I think we might have talked about something sort of similar to lists. The next up is lists. So a list is just as you might guess, it's a list of things. And in this case, it can be a list of strings or numbers. And that's strings or numbers puts inside brackets, separated by commas, can create a list. Okay, and so we got this list example. I can put in a string, and I can create a list. Cool thing about a list, I'll just sort of jump ahead and give you a little. If I have this list example, I can call out the entities inside that list. So I can say, give me the first thing on the list, which is the 0th thing, because 0 is the starting, where Python starts counting at 0. And it'll just give me the content of the 0th thing in the list. I can say, give me the thing in 1, which is actually 2, which is a little confusing. And then I can say, give me the thing in the third space isn't there because it starts with 0. So it's 0, 1, 2. So actually I need to do the second space. And then it can give me the content of the thing that's at 2. So that's just a sort of jumping ahead there. But a list is a list of things, and you can access those individual components of the list. Sort of like a list on steroids is a data type called a data frame. Now, numbers, strings, and lists are all inherent to Python. So they come out of the box as data types that Python knows about. To deal with a data frame, you actually need some more code than normal Python. And so you access what's called a library. So a library is just a collection of more Python code that lives somewhere and that does something. So it's usually a list of functions, and you can import libraries so that you don't have to type everything out again, right? And so a library that gets used a lot is a library called pandas. And pandas is a data analysis library. And it's pandas that provides for the data type of data frames, which is something we're going to use a heck of a lot down below. The way you load a library is you use some code that looks like this. It says import. And then what we're going to do is we're going to import the pandas library as PD. And that's actually, we're using that as an abbreviation. So instead of in our code having to always refer back to the pandas library, we can just use the words PD to stand in for pandas. And so we'll use that later. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this cell. Nothing's going to look like it's happening, but what's happening is that it took a second there to run. It was loading all of the library of pandas in. Okay, so let's create a data frame from scratch. So here this PD says, go to that pandas library and do something. And inside that pandas library is something called DataFrame. You can see this looks like a function, right? It's got a name, it's got a parenthetical, and you pass things to it, okay? I'm passing something called columns inside what looks like a list. And I'm passing it a list inside what looks like a list. And what this is going to do is this is going to create, let's just run this. It's going to create a little table where the column ID, where the columns called ID and thing, and a row where the value was 1 and thing 1 in those first two columns. Data frames, you can put a data frame to print like you would a variable. So again, here, like a variable, if it's the only thing in the cell or the last thing in the cell, it'll echo out its contents to the world. But if it was not the last thing, right, if I had something else there, I wouldn't see it. So if I want to see this, I actually have to do something more. I have multiple frames. So you use, instead of print, you use display, and it'll look pretty. I could use print, but it doesn't look so pretty, right? If I did print there, it prints it, but it doesn't look as pretty. Okay, so we're gonna use display. To use display though, you have to load in this other library. So we'll do that here down below. But we're now, instead of just making this data frame right from scratch here, we're gonna do it in parts, because you're likely not gonna build it all from scratch in one line of code. In fact, actually, normally you'll just load in a data frame from a file. But if we were gonna build a data frame from scratch, I can create an empty data frame. So here I have a variable called df for data frame example. I assign that variable to have the content of a data frame. Here, however, I did not give it a row, so it's an empty data frame. I can, however, take that data frame held inside this variable, and I can use this append method. So I can take the data frame and I can append to it a new row, which is what this is going on here. And this ignore index true is just saying the index is the sort of the number here that identifies what row it is. It's saying don't make new index numbers. And so what I'm doing is I'm just saying create a new data frame and then append or add a row. And then I'm loading this little library, and then I'm using display, and I'm displaying out what that data frame now looks like. So there we go. Looks very much like this here. I treated the number a little differently. Here it's treating it as an integer. Here it's treating it as a floating point. We're not going to get into the details of that. Just know they're both numbers. Did you catch something there, though? I did something with comments, right? So I had this hash and then some text. So you can use these hashes to comment your code. And what it means to comment out your code is if you have this hash, then the text that falls after that, the computer's not going to try to interpret as code. It's just going to skip over it and then the next thing is code. So you can use it to write little notes to yourself, or if you want to, you can use it to comment out some code and that code won't run. So there, I didn't append the value and it just had that blank. It just made a blank data frame. You might do that if you want to make a change to your code, but you don't want to delete it because you might want to come back and use it again. So why do we have data types? This is just a rehash of what we talked about before with JavaScript, right? Let's compare these two situations where I have a variable 1 and 2, and then I add them together, versus 1 and 2, and then I add them together. So the difference, of course, is that here they're numbers, here they're strings, and plus is different, right? Here plus is smushing them together. So it looks like 1 plus 2 equals 12, which is, doesn't make any sense because it's 1 and 2 smushed together. But here it actually is doing the math. So that's, again, that's just back to our JavaScript example about data types. If you want to figure out how to do math, here's a link to an article on operators that tells you all the different operators that you can use in Python. They're, for the most part, look very much like the ones you saw in JavaScript. And that is introduction to notebooks, right? So that is a notebook. You can create cells, you can type code in there, you can delete cells, you can reorder cells, you can add text. If I want to make this text, I turn this to Markdown, and I can type some stuff in there, and then just have it be text. If you want to know how to do Markdown, I had a link above when I introduced Markdown here, which will take you to a page that will show you how to do some simple Markdown, so you can figure out how to make things bold or italics, that sort of thing. So you can write comments there. You're not going to really be commenting your notebooks this week. You're just going to be working through this single notebook using the text I've put there as a guide. And that is your first introduction to notebooks. And come back to the video below and we'll start talking about data wrangling. So exciting that.